Hey guys, see you out there on the stream. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. We're going to let in our live audience here, spotlight myself and our esteemed guest for the day. Very excited about this one. It's always great to be among seasoned professionals and people who have a passion for music. Um, I'll give a little bit of an intro. Sorry, we're starting to touch late, but we'll go maybe 5 minutes over today. Um, I'll give an intro to the program momentarily to give a little bit of context, and we'll intro our guests and we'll get rolling with the show. Of course, a lot of you I see familiar faces and names out there in our private Zoom call. I know some of you folks are out there on YouTube and Facebook, and so you know what's going on. But for those of you that maybe this is your first time, give you some context. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. What we do here is we gather here every Saturday to meet with and learn from the most fascinating and knowledgeable folks in the piano world. This might include manufacturers, rebuilders, musicians, instrumentalists of all sorts, makers of other instruments, and of course, piano techs. Our mutual goal is to become better at our crafts, to help each other, and to create an ever more musical world together. Piano Tech Radio Hour is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, an online learning resource that brings you cutting-edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. You can find out more at pianotechniciansmasterclass.com. You can also subscribe to this program we call Radio Hour. It's just modest $16 a month. You get direct access to each week's private Zoom call, as well as the archival recordings of over 200 episodes in our member area. Join using the link bit.ly/join PTRH. Don't forget about our podcast audio-only version of this program. You can find that at pianotechradio.com. Our blog on Substack has awesome information you'll never find anywhere else. Also, pay attention pretty much every third Thursday of each month. We have an amazing masterclass. We just did a masterclass with Danilo Massetti on basically the history of pedaling techniques, which included all sorts of awesome action illustrations from different types of pianos, harpsichords, and whatnot throughout the year, and showing us exactly how the damper mechanisms work and talking how it affected pedaling. Really fascinating program by another seasoned musician, but also quite technical. And I mentioned the Substack and our socials, of course. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, all that good stuff. All right, let us introduce our wonderful guest, Rachel Barton Pine, a
Hi, well, thank
celebrated,
you for letting
yeah,
me crash your piano party. I didn't know
yeah,
that I have much to offer in the way of information about keyboard action, but it's going to be really fun to talk to you.
yeah. Well, we have had, I'll give your intro here for context in a minute. I'm sure a lot of people already know of you, but um, we've had several violinists, and we even had violin maker on the program within the past couple of months. So we'll have some wonderful contacts, and we have some seeds of kind of interesting things to talk about. But yeah, let me give you a bio if you don't mind. A celebrated violinist, recording artist, musical historian. Her work bridges tradition and innovation. She's got 40 albums and performances, more than 40 albums and performances, alongside major symphony orchestras worldwide. She's known for her virtuosic playing, deep commitment to musical scholarship. Through her advocacy, Rachel honors the legacy and artistry of Black composers, weaving their works into the fabric of the classical music tradition. Her performances are often featuring period instruments and draw on extensive historical research, offering audiences dynamic, richly informed experiences of Baroque, Renaissance, and medieval music. Okay, welcome officially to the program, Rachel. Thanks for your patience.
Great to be here.
You're like, well, I know all that stuff. I don't need to do that. So you were actually just telling me you were adjudicating a competition currently. Tell us about the competition and give us some context about what's going on in your life right now. I see these scads of like archival something or other behind you. I'm assuming it's
This
maybe
is
sheet
part
music or
of my
something.
sheet music collection.
This is your sheet music collection.
Yes, I'm
Wow.
home. I'm home in my condo for a few days before going off to the next concerto performance, and I'm here in my music library. Of course, I've bought a lot of this stuff. I don't even want to think about how many thousands I've spent in my lifetime on sheet music,
Wow.
but I've
Yeah.
also been very, very lucky to have inherited collections from retirees, nephews or people who passed away and their heirs knew that I was friends with them and interested in music from the 1800s. So yeah, it's really fun to have access to all of these scores. And you know what? Not everything lives online. So
Hmm.
good to be able to just put your hands on it.
Now, I have to say, it looks quite organized, but
Indeed.
yeah, is it? I don't know. And how do you put the organization together? Is there a point in which you say, okay, I got to move this green one over here, fit this one in here? I don't what's
Well, a lot of them
the
are,
method to the madness there?
yeah, gosh, I love that. I'm so happy you asked. We've got concertos, we've got sonatas, pieces with piano, various combinations of instruments for chamber music. And I tend to do by letter, right? So you've got concertos box A. So it might only be half full, but with room to grow. So then you wouldn't have to add another box
Right.
until you finish out that letter, that kind of.
Hmm.
So yeah, I've got a few piles waiting to be filed, but generally it tends to stay pretty organized so that I can find what I need and know what I have, and I type it all into a spreadsheet. So if I'm looking, and I have a column, for example, for dedicatee. So if I'm looking to see, okay, who wrote something for Ezai, then I can just search on that and find all my options.
Amazing. Well, good on you for keeping that organized. I feel like I have different levels of organization. On some levels, I'm just impeccably organized. And then there's places where I go, man, I could really do better, And I'm always impressed when people have archival organization. I have a ton of files that I want, just like digital files. It's like every once in a while I sit down and get like 10% of them in some type of order, and the rest just kind of
Yeah.
sit
So
there.
actually, one of the jewels of my collection is the world's largest archive of music for violin alone, music for unaccompanied violin. Um,
Hmm.
there was a gentleman in Sweden who made this his life's work, collecting data about these works and as many of the actual scores as he could. So he published a book at the end of the century, end of the last century, which was listing about 2,500 titles from the 1600s to the present, and he himself had around 1,200 in his personal collection, which is exponentially more than even the most wide collection at a university or a public library. Um,
Wow.
so it was an extraordinary archive that he himself possessed, and I had gotten in touch with him because I was really interested in the unaccompanied genre. Of course, I grew up in a very financially struggling family, so sometimes I would play something without piano accompaniment, even though I love collaborating with piano, just to
Mhm.
save a buck because you have to pay your pianist by the hour. So I ended
Sure.
up doing more unaccompanied music than most of my peers would have. But then it turned out to be useful, first of all. You can go on the radio, you can, play in somebody's living room, school visits, hospital visits,
Hmm.
encores after concertos. There's so many occasions where just you and your violin, if you have a variety of things to play, it's so helpful. But I also became fascinated by how do composers approach the problem of writing for just a four-string bowed stringed instrument, because piano naturally lends itself, piano, guitar, viola da gamba, these are instruments that are meant to be self-sufficient, that can kind of
Hmm.
cover multiple voices and a broader range, and violin is meant to play with others in chamber groups as a melodic
Hmm.
voice with somebody else accompanying. Playing alone is not kind of how the violin was designed, but there have been so many different ways that composers have confronted this puzzle, um,
Hmm.
which have been incredibly successful. And so, yeah, so I was always jealous of pianists. They can just walk out and play a recital all by themselves. Not that I don't love collaboration, there's nothing more
Yes.
rewarding. But that being said, sometimes just being able to just do your own thing and commune with your instrument, all of you pianists know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it's so fun to be able to do that on violin.
Yes, and us pianists and technicians are jealous of your instrument because you could just strap it in a little pack and carry it around, go anywhere you want.
And hope that
And
TSA allows it on the airplane, right?
yeah, yeah. TSA, yeah.
So yeah.
They're
Pros
not
and
uh
cons.
they're not aficionados and they don't always understand. And that violin case, unfortunately is notoriously recognized as a way to smuggle the Tommy gun back in the what was it, right? Well, that was like the time of
Hey, just because
Al
I'm in
Capone or
Chicago
something.
doesn't mean that
Are you in Chicago? Is that where you're located?
lived here my whole life.
Oh, great. So I'm actually, we probably should have gotten together in person, to be honest. But I'm in Elmhurst, Illinois
Oh my
right now.
goodness.
That's right. That's where I'm at.
Whoa.
Yeah. What are
Yeah.
you? Are you next door? Oh my gosh. Great.
Hey, hi.
Hello. What area do you live in?
River North, right downtown.
Oh yeah, that's a great. So much to do. Oh, that's awesome. I'm jealous and you know
I can
the
walk to
wet.
Orchestra Hall.
Oh yeah, that's great. Good on you. That's wonderful. Well, I'm wanting to. I just had something that was in my mind. I can't get it out of my head, so I want to go back and ask a question. Do you have a favorite box? Oh, this one just happens to have a lot of, of this composer
Wow.
that I like, or these type of pieces, or
Actually,
something.
I
Or
have
is
a
it
wow, that's such an interesting question. Honestly, I have a favorite folio. So
okay?
I own Cartier's own personal copy of The Art of the Violin that he published in the late 1700s as a compendium of sonatas that he wanted to preserve from the earlier 1700s. And it has
Oh,
all of his own emendations in a red pen with commentary, fingerings, and so on. So it's really an extraordinary item of this, just kind of groundbreaking collection to have his own personal copy. And that's
wow.
really the coolest thing of everything.
And
But
is that one of those things where, you kind of are able to sort of come across it and just acquire it relatively easily because there's like a low, maybe like a small number of folks that find that interesting? Or is this type of thing where it's like you have to like buy that at an auction because it's like priceless or something, like how do you
I
acquire things
wasn't
like that?
I didn't know it existed. I wasn't looking. I mean, I knew the art of violin existed. I'd been studying
Yeah.
it for years, but I didn't know his own personal copy was floating around. And it happened to be the Isaac Stern auction. So I'm not sure how it went from Paris Conservatory ultimately to Isaac Stern. He wasn't really into historically informed anything, great artist.
Hmm.
That wasn't his thing. And so
Hmm.
I can't imagine that he had much use for it other than a item of historic
For
curiosity.
fun. Yeah.
But yeah, it was part of his auction. The folks showing up to the Isaac Stern auction were not, the historic researchers. So, if it had been in a different collection, at auction,
Yes.
there probably would have been a bidding war with various,
Okay.
the Newberry Library and who knows who. But as it was, like nobody who was showing up for Isaac Stern memorabilia wanted this thing, so I got it at a steal.
Nice.
It almost felt guilty for how little I paid for it, but.
That's great. Congratulations. And I had another question that came up as you were speaking. Do you have a particularly favorite or striking approach to solo violin? In terms of the way that you said, like people's approaches that you've come across to kind of fill it out or kind of do use special techniques to, and do you find in the solo violin it's oh hey we'll just make a melody and you'll play it, or do you find that there's sort of like a conscious approach by many composers to go, this is solo and therefore I'm going to try to throw in some cool tricks, a lot of double stops and you know things like that.
Well, definitely, the virtuoso repertoire, some of the hardest pieces ever written for violin were written for violin alone.
Mm,
Ernst, Last Rose of Summer variations, Paganini Nel Corpo Mi Sento variations. Some of these things are just like, here's what's possible. We're going to do it all and blow your mind. But other times, of course, like going all the way back to Bach and the composers that inspired him, the idea is let's pretend that there are multiple instruments, a cello and two violins, or three violins, or, you know, accompaniment and melody all at the same time, smushed into one violin part. And so having the polyphony going is really quite wild. Actually, what's really interesting, you would have thought that the longest fugue that Bach ever wrote would have been for ensemble or perhaps for keyboard, since that was his primary instrument. But actually, the first instrument Bach studied was violin, which he learned from his violinist father, Johann Ambrosius. And
mm,
so, actually, the longest fugue he ever wrote was for solo violin, the C
wow.
major from the third sonata. So that's pretty wild. And it goes into as many as four voices, one per string. You can't play them all simultaneously like you can on the
Mhm.
piano, but it's
Right.
almost like you're
Just sweep
faking
it.
it. Yeah, you're playing a bit of this and a bit of that. And so the brain processes it as these voices going simultaneously, even though they're very cleverly interspersed. Um,
Wow.
And so that's, yeah, that's pretty mind blowing. And of course, color is another thing, you
What
know.
was that? I'm gonna go check that out at some point soon.
Oh,
The name of that
so
composition again?
Sonata number 3 in C major, BWV 1005, and it's the second movement fugue. Of course, I have that on my own Bach album called Testament, but it's, yeah, one of my favorite pieces ever. Um, but it's fun. There are a couple other things that are often done, and you see this. Well, if you think about piano, like some of the impressionistic music, where it's trying to conjure up ideas that aren't just, plunking keys of a keyboard, right? It's trying to evoke bells or running water or, just all kinds of stuff. And so, even if it's not explicit to nature or anything, just exploiting and exploring all of the different sound effects and colors that a violin can create. And the palette is still expanding. Contemporary composers will always come up with one more and one more and one more sound effect that nobody's done before. You'd think everything possible would have already been done by now, but there's always something new going on, which is really, really cool. And yeah, and then of course, the violin doesn't just play classical music, right? This exact same instrument plays jazz and plays various types of fiddling, American fiddling, Celtic fiddling, klezmer, just it's endless. And so what's really fun is when you get a piece that is inspired by one or another kind of traditional music or folk music or whatever kind of non-classical music, and then bringing those elements to a composed classical space, but still retaining some of that flavor. So some of
Hmm.
my favorite fiddly things are some of these solo violin works.
Mm, that's so cool. The one thing to just sort of a multi-part uh, preparation for this sort of question or area of exploration. Number one, I'm struck you just have such enthusiasm. I think uh, all performers are different. Performers have different personalities. Some are sort of just very chill and withdrawn, and they may be excellent performers. But you really have a passion when you're speaking about these things, exploring these things. Filling your shelves with historical pages and not everybody was there a couple days ago on Thursday when we did our master class with Danilo Massetti, and he talked about the history of the piano and the keyboard instrument. It was the same thing. It's like, wow, this guy is nuts for, again, he's a piano player. And to see the detail in which he cared about like the structure and the action of these obscure historical instruments that even I would say probably less than 5 or 10% of professional piano technicians these days go take the time to research that type of history. So,
What's fascinating is the fact that when a stringed instrument gets with a keyboard instrument,
mm,
the keyboard that's playing with you impacts everything that you do as a string player. The action
absolutely.
of the keys is going to make you do different things with the articulation of your bow strokes. I had
Hmm.
a mind-blowing experience, really transformative. A couple of years ago, well, I've been to the festival more than once, but in the oh gosh, what is it called? Something Valley. Anyway, it's in California,
Okay.
and they have Valley of the Moon. That's what it is.
Okay.
Valley of the Moon, and it's Baroque, but also classical and even romantic music played with gut strings, with appropriate, pitches
Yeah.
and appropriate keyboards. So they
Hmm.
like pianos from the early 1800s, pianos from the later 1800s, and so on, and playing romantic music that you're used to playing with a Steinway or something, with these
Hmm.
pianos from the 1800s.
Yes.
I mean, I've played very often with early classical, usually replica, forte pianos, Mozart stuff, and so on, right? I've played,
Hmm.
countless harpsichords, but to play with these romantic era pianos, it affected just everything about my sound, about my timing, about my phrasing. It was absolutely fascinating, and I had no idea that the
Mm.
piano was so different because we tend to talk about harpsichord, forte piano, modern piano. At
Right.
least in the string world, we tend to be basic like that. Maybe
Hmm.
not as much in the keyboard world, I don't know, but yeah, it was so cool. And I was like, oh darn, now my ear has been spoiled and I'm not going to want to play this repertoire anymore with the wrong piano, meaning a Steinway. But no,
Hmm.
I still enjoy it with a Steinway.
Yeah. It's a very valid point you make, and I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one, another tidbit from a recent masterclass, the idea that Bach didn't always play on an instrument that allowed for this sort of clean type of style we associate with Bach. Like Bach isn't associated with letting the pedal go, for example, but apparently, there was that was not necessarily what it was like at Bach's time, right? And so first of all, it's fascinating that the sounds we've grown accustomed to, over the past several decades, call it in the United States, or scores of decades or something, we have a sound that we associate with these pieces, and people don't even imagine, oh, that's not what it sounded like. And I think these days, now that there's just so much more access to research and historical information and more people sharing, we're beginning to be able to hear these things. And what I love about it is the it sounds new and fresh,
Yeah.
right? So you're
Oh,
listening to
yeah.
something, it's sort of older, but it's a sound you're like, wow, I never heard anything like that before. Wow, how cool, how ethereal, how mysterious or something. Yes.
You're absolutely right. It's like frustrating, but also interesting and even exciting to think that we don't yet know everything. I wish we had all the information already right now, but the fact that we're still able to discover new things, I think that my favorite story about Bach and color is the oboe da Cascia. If you go back 30 years, people just thought, of course there's, other things da Cascia, but they thought oboe da Cascia, hunting oboe, like that was just an evocative marking meant to kind of give you a sense of the spirit of the music, but you would play it on a normal Baroque oboe. And
Mhm.
then they actually found in an archive or museum or something, found evidence that that there actually was this instrument, literally an oboe with a brass horn bell on the end of it. And they
Wow.
managed to recreate this, and it had a totally different sound. It was totally workable. It
Hmm.
existed, it could be played. And Harnoncourt had to re-record like a whole bunch of the cantatas that he'd already recorded in his complete collection because he'd unknowingly been using the wrong instrument. And now there's an
Mm.
oboe da Cascia, and that was pretty darn recently.
Fascinating. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into how and where the historical fascination came in, because I know you've been playing the instrument for many, many years. You started very young, of course, playing classical music, by definition, you kind of have to look at the history, right? And this composer
Well,
was at this and that time. But,
maybe,
um,
maybe not. These days, sadly, I mean, it's a great thing that pedagogy has become ever more refined and that we're teaching kids at younger and younger ages to be able
mhm,
to effectively move around the fingerboard or the keyboard and play these hard pieces when they're very young. But then it's, the profession gets in danger of becoming like a sport where it's all
mm,
about, technique and being fast
mhm,
and being young and doing these hard pieces. And it's like, okay, but what does it mean? And what I love about art is that, in fact, the technique is secondary to, it only serves the expression. And, you can, of course, keep playing your instrument till a far older age than you could do most athletics. But that also, your technique can even improve decades down the road as you become more and more refined. We're very
mm,
lucky to be in this field. But, when I see students who are like, oh, that person played that piece so well, they nailed everything. It's like, well, did they move you? Did they
mm,
have something really interesting to say with the phrasing? So that's what we have to not lose sight of. And I've given master classes where I've said to the performer, what country is your composer from and what century did they live in? Like the bare bones, right? And they didn't even know. And these days, there's no excuse. You don't have to get in the car and go to the library and find a reference book. Like you just pick up your phone and 30 seconds later, you have your answer. And if you've been practicing this piece for, cumulatively probably hundreds of lifetime hours and you haven't even taken that 30 seconds, then,
Hmm.
you know, so what I always try to do is encourage people to be curious. And this was instilled in me through, the great good luck of being homeschooled. Um, I was going to, traditional school when I was little. And then in third grade, my school principal suggested to my mom that I discontinue attending school, which
Oh,
sounds like I
wow.
got expelled, but I promise that wasn't the
Let's
case.
get her out of here.
But I would go to school, come home, practice, and then do my homework in the car on the way to rehearsals in the suburbs, and then eat my dinner on the way home from rehearsal. And that was my entire life. And the principal recognized that, it wasn't healthy for me to not be able to have a social life. And so, ironically, my social life was better when I wasn't attending school because,
Hmm.
the academic work. You can do it in much, much fewer hours per week than if you're in the classroom, right?
Yeah.
You just knock it right out and on your kitchen table, and then you can practice, and then you have the afternoon free to play with friends. So yeah, so we started homeschooling. I don't think my mom had ever even heard of it. This was, the 80s, and not not, today it's so much more widespread and socially acceptable. But at
Right.
first we were doing exactly what I would have been doing at school, except doing it myself to save time. But then my mom started reading some of these homeschooling newsletters and stuff, and she realized that there were different approaches that you could take educationally. And an approach that really fascinated her was this idea of learner directed interests, where instead of saying, okay, this month you're going to learn about ancient Egypt, next month you're going to learn about ancient Greece, et cetera, that instead, like, what does the kid want to learn about, and then let them go as far with it as they want. So if I still was wanted to know more about that topic, nobody would tell me, okay, nope, done with that, time to move on. Be like, okay, let's go get another stack of books and keep going. And because as long as you know it all by the end, it doesn't matter what order you learn it in, or anything like that. So that's kind of how I started to approach the learning of my academic topics. And, just by following my curiosity, letting myself dig deep, that started to spill over into my music making. Before that, I was like any other kid, all about the etudes and the beautiful music. But then I was like, oh, while I'm at the library here, I want to get a biography of that composer. And then that would, maybe there'd be something about the culture of that time and place. And oh, I want to learn more about life in Salzburg in the 1780s. And then I would get a book about that. And you're just, because nobody's stopping you, and that you have the luxury of time to be able to do these things. That's how, I started doing that. And then, eventually, of course, I graduated high school, but I really didn't change how I lived my life. I still kept, looking for books about things I was interested in, whether it was music or otherwise.
Wow, yeah. I'm also curious about, thank you for sharing about that. And sorry, my computer just had a quick dive and I plugged it in and went to the phone real quick and I'm back. But I heard all that. Um, just going back, just pedaling back a little bit. What kind of friends did you end up hanging out with? It's actually so just a little preface here. I was homeschooled in I think it was just eighth grade or something like that, maybe seventh and eighth grade. Um, it sounds like a different experience because I was basically just out of school and totally on my own, which is like a story for another day. But I'm curious, what term, where did your social interactions come from? Was it the neighbor kids? Was there some sort of the kids that maybe you were in an orchestra with? How did that come together?
All kinds of different, I lived on a residential street, so there were kids on my block, kids from church. My youth group was very, very active. I kept up with a few friends from elementary school, but that didn't last long because there
Yeah.
was really no basis after a certain point. But um, Yeah, and then lots and lots of friends from music school and from the Civic Orchestra of Chicago that I started playing in when I was 11. Of course, that orchestra is designed for college, graduate, and postgraduate students. So it's not like I was hanging out with them when I was 11, but by the time I was 14, I gotten to know some of them and they would invite me for parties. And yeah, it was the life. So
That's
people would say,
great.
"Oh, you're not in school. You won't get to go to homecoming." And I'm like, "Well, I go to enough college parties. I'm fine." So that
That's
was
great.
yeah, and yeah, I mean, a lot of kids, of course, there are different kinds of homeschooling. Sometimes you do it for, just learning style. Sometimes you do it for academic reasons. Sometimes you do it for lifestyle reasons. But, special interest kids, it's like child actors, Olympians, etc. So that, we fell into that narrow category of people who did it for convenience. And there are homeschool meetups, but we quickly discovered that those homeschoolers were sort of on a different path. Like when they'd be reading about something in history, they would do these amazing things, like make a whole diorama about it and do all these arts and crafts. And I just unfortunately didn't have that much extra time to go in those kinds of directions. So ultimately, most of my friends ended up being musicians. So we would go to concerts and we would go dancing and we would play chamber music together. And that's what it was.
And what area was it again? So I know you're in River North now. What area where did you grow up
So
in?
I grew up on the north side of the city, just north of Wrigleyville. If anybody
Okay.
knows what I'm talking about, it was called North Center, the
Okay.
particular neighborhood. But yeah, so it was about a 20-minute drive to downtown, not bad. A much longer drive out to all the lessons in the suburbs. So,
Mm.
but on the other hand, kids come from other states to study with those top teachers. So at least we were only coming from Chicago and not from Wisconsin or Michigan or Iowa or whatever. So,
Are you by chance, this is going to come out of left field, are you aware of a gentleman named Ken Stein, who's like a
oh,
violin?
absolutely. I love
Yeah,
Ken. Yeah, owner of a wonderful violin shop and such a kind and generous person.
yeah. Ken and I are friends. His shop is in the town where I'm in, and Elmhurst, and my son takes cello lessons, so I'm a very amateur cello player because
Awesome.
I take it along with him, and we rent our cellos from Ken. And I actually did some. I've helped Ken with lots of things. We've connected. It's been fun.
Cool.
Um, and then there's another Stein,
Well,
Liz
you have
Stein,
to
is
tell
it?
Ken and Lisa I said hi.
I will definitely. Yeah, that'll be fun. Um, Wonderful information. Tell me Tell me a little bit about where you see things going for you, right? So we've talked about, where you've been. We talked about how some of your upbringing, how you got into the history of things. When you look to your career or life now into the future, do you plan it out much? Do you just kind of like see what happens? What's next on
Oh,
the
I've got
pipeline
a
for
whole
you?
plan for
Okay,
sure.
tell me what's
My
up.
plan is to not ever stop. So, I'm hoping that, through hard work that I will be able to maintain my technique into my 80s like Milstein. He was still playing the hardest virtuoso pieces in his 80s, but some of that might be genetic luck and there might be things beyond my control and, I'll have to accept whatever I do. Heifetz didn't perform past his 70s and he was one of the greatest. So,
Mm,
but I'll go as long as I can because I not only love performing, I actually am a lucky person who loves the lifestyle. I mean, not that you like waiting at the gate while your plane is delayed for 2 hours, but even that isn't the end of the world. I can answer my emails but I love traveling. I love being in a different city or country every week, seeing old friends, meeting new friends, seeing the world. I just love it. And so definitely, I'll keep doing it as long as I can. And then, if I'm no longer playing the quantity of solo performances that I currently do, then I'm going to definitely fill up my time teaching. I've not taken a professorship heretofore, both because I'm always on the road and I don't feel I'd be able to see my students as consistently as I would want to, but more importantly, my daughter, who's now 13, I practice with her every day, actually, and the cumulative hours per week is like as if I had a full-time professorship. So, and I want to be the one to work with her because it's our time together and it's really special. And I only get one shot at it. So,
mm,
um,
mm.
Yeah, so at some point I'll have a professorship for sure, and then, continue doing the things I'm already doing, giving master classes everywhere, working with other people, students one-on-one, if they have a particular piece of repertoire that I know real well, or they have a particular event coming up that they need a little extra push for.
Mhm.
And then continuing all of my publication activities. I've got a long list of different editions and collections that I want to work on in terms of violin music. Then, of course, we've got our Music by Black Composers project, which I started back in 2001. So it's kind of wild how it's gone from something that was seen as very fringe and that people were really questioning why I was so into this to suddenly everybody realized what, the value of for society, but also this wonderful repertoire. And it's just going great gangbusters. We're going to be releasing our first volumes for flute this summer. So I'll be hanging out at the National Flute Association gathering, which is going to be, I've never gone to a whole gathering of flautists before. That'll be a new life experience. But we've got plans for all kinds of other instruments and all kinds of other things. So I definitely have at least a few decades more work to do with that project. And of course, recordings. Actually, just a few days ago, my management and I met and kind of hammered out the next 10 years or so of recording projects and put them in
Oh.
order. And there's many more beyond that that I already know that I want to do or hope to do, as long as my hands hold up. So yeah, I will never be bored. And I definitely plan never to retire because, sitting around doing nothing sounds like punishment.
Mm. Yeah, I can tell that also. You have that type of personality. Tell me, I actually, so I did some time in academia. Who knows, maybe there's not in music. Well, I studied music. I studied piano in the undergraduate, but at the graduate level, I studied the sciences. And I'm sure I may continue in that path sometime down the line. But I have friends who are continuing in science and research and laboratory work. And when it comes down to positions, it really comes down to like what opens up where, and maybe I'll go to Ohio or I'll go to Kansas or Tennessee. It's just kind of like, okay, they're flexible to where they go. I'm curious for you as you envision potentially going into academia. Is it a thing where you're like, well, I'd really like to be in Chicago, like that's where I'd like to stay, or maybe you'd like to be someplace else, or maybe you have that attitude of like, whatever the opportunity is at the time that I want to do it, I'm flexible to go there. What's your attitude there?
Oh, wow. Yeah, we're really getting into the weeds here, making
Why
me
not?
reveal. I love it. I love it. Yeah, and honestly, that is, I don't want to insult any of the schools here in town. We've got some excellent music schools, but the truth of the matter is we don't have one of the country's top conservatories here in Chicago, which is really kind of sad and mystifying in a way because we have one of the country's top orchestras. Um, but we don't have a designated, conservatory that's like one of the destination ones. And I
Mhm.
don't want to leave Chicago. I've lived here my whole life. I love so many things about it. I could go on, but this is my favorite place. So I'd probably end up commuting. My husband has his pilot's license now, and
Oh,
I could see
okay.
him, flying us to wherever for a couple days and then coming home and doing that every week because why not?
There you go. Well, that sounds fun. Um, my father-in-law and my brother-in-law are pilots, but we're not at the level where they do a lot of private flights. It's more like they work for the airlines and stuff. But that's so yeah, that would be so cool. And I feel like as in the musical domain, when it comes to academia, the departments tend to be pretty flexible, knowing that you have touring to do, and you have a musical life that often means you can't really sit still at that place every day. So, yeah, interesting. Well, thank you for answering that question. It sounds like it could be a little bit political, but I don't think we'll offend anybody. Um, what about your actual instruments? Because we've talked to some violin makers. Again, I'm friends with Ken. It doesn't mean I know a lot about, stringed instrument, maintenance and manufacturing. But can you say anything about the instruments that you keep and why and how you came across them?
Yeah. So, um, these days, of course, it's so ironic because when I first started lessons at age 3, I'd seen some middle school girls playing violin in my church, and I was just intrigued by the sound of the instrument. So I was asking for a violin, but my parents were like, "Well, don't kids normally start on piano?" And maybe, but then they realized getting a, like really junky upright would still cost more than renting a teeny tiny violin. So they thought, well, it looks like violins are cheaper. Little did they know that the 7 foot Steinway sitting in my living room costs less than one of my bows. So we're
Oh,
not even talking about the actual violin, which
holy
of course I
cow.
don't own because, they have been, you know, bought and sold on the collector's market for so many generations that and they're not very liquid, but they've never gone down in price. So for people diversifying their portfolios with something super secure, it's often the way that they choose to go, even if they aren't music lovers,
Wow.
which is kind of wild when you think about it. But yeah, so
So wait
basically
a second, let me stop there.
yeah.
So is this kind of like uh, I may be totally misreading, or this may be exactly right. Like, so for example, in New York City, you hear that some wealthy guy in Dubai is going to buy an apartment or a flat in New York City because the real estate's so precious. Yeah, and then he could rent it out or sell it. It's just basically like because he can, he buys it, and then whatever happens to it happens to it. Somebody else might live there or whatever. You're saying that happens with the high-end violins? That it
Absolutely.
just becomes a property that someone has, and then maybe you're renting it from a wealthy person or something.
Yeah, it's not exactly like a rental. Basically,
Yeah.
the value of violins, the first factor is the maker's name.
Mhm.
Second factor is the condition of the instrument. Has it had a lot of damage and repair, or is it in pretty good health? The third is its history. Was it played
Mhm.
by a famous artist of the past or featured in famous books, etc. And by far, the distant fourth factor is how does it actually sound, which is crazy, right? So you can have a badly damaged Strad, but if it's a Strad and it used to, it gave all these premieres in the 1800s and is a famous Strad, maybe it doesn't even sound good at all, but it's going to be millions of dollars, even though a
Mhm.
performer might not even want to play on it. So it's a really weird thing the way that that works. But there is the best antiques, Guarneri's, Stradivari's. There is a difference in their sound, and so it's not like, well, I'm just going to get a great modern instrument and pay for
Mhm.
its voice and not worry about all this other nonsense. Because I guess the best way to describe it is newer instruments can have colors that are just as gorgeous as antiques, but they don't have as many because it's like
Mhm.
a fine wine aging. You just gain complexity with time. And so it's like painting with a Crayola box of 36 versus countless millions of Pantones. And so, a performer who's going and doing a lot of solo appearances, concertos with orchestra and so on, you really do need a top quality violin. And they are priced such that even if you have a very successful career, you can no longer even dream of buying one yourself. It's just outside of the realm of possibility. And so you do have to get the loan of instruments and it's a win-win situation because like I said, the history is part of the value. So if the instrument is continuing to make recordings and have a prominent life through its player, that's good for its owner.
Mhm.
It's healthier for them to be played as long as they're properly cared for, because if they're just sitting around, their voices kind of go to sleep. So it needs to be vibrated. It's not being worn out like certain kinds
Mhm.
of winds and brass. It's actually better for it to be vibrated and played. And
Mhm.
the recipient pays the annual insurance, which is a hefty chunk of change, believe me. So, yeah, so it's great. It's, wonderful for an artist to have the generous loan of instrument, but it also benefits the owner as well. So it's a win-win.
And how long typically are you going to loan an instrument? Is it like, oh, just for a month or two, just for one concert? Is it I want to have it for a whole year so I can get used to playing it?
Yeah, I mean it's the worst thing in the world to get a short-term loan, because then, there's not as much standardization of size. I mean, they're generally within the same ballpark, but there are just little, micromillimeter differences in the touch and the note where the notes are, and just to even figure out your way around an instrument, but then to find all of the possibilities in its voice. This can take years. So, for example, I have the Guarneri del Jesu that I play on lifetime loan, which is an unusual level of security. Typically, long-term loans will just renew every few years or something like that. My foundation also has an instrument loan program where we support students and young artists in their early career stages. And certainly with our with the young artists who are, on their way to becoming soloists and are using our finer instruments, we do lend them for longer. Some of the other young artists who are, doing well, but maybe going more in an orchestral direction or a chamber direction, then ultimately do need to be able to buy their own instrument, which wouldn't have to be one of these top instruments, but, something beautiful that's going to serve them well. And then,
Hmm.
let them play ours until they're at the point that they can switch over.
Cool.
Then we can lend it to the next young artist and help launch them. So we've helped more than 100 young artists up till now with our instrument loan program and financial assistance program, and that's been um, really incredible to be able to give back for some of the help that I received when I was coming up.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. So well, first, I just want to say to our audience here, we don't always have engagement or interaction, but if anybody out there wants to put a comment or question in the chat or engage, please raise your hand or put something in, and we'll definitely put some attention to it in the last several minutes of the program here. And I had a question because I found so it's always I
I don't
find
think
it,
I actually adequately answered your previous question.
which
So,
was,
well, about my instruments. So this is
oh
my
yeah, so you talked
violin,
about
right?
what you have, yeah,
I won't take too much time, but I have what you might call subsidiary instruments. So I have a gorgeous Baroque violin, which is not just a question of throwing gut strings on it. It actually has the neck set at a lower angle.
yeah.
Um, and the bridge is different, the tailpiece is different, and even the vibrating parts inside. So it really is the body and the scroll are the same, but the setup is totally different. I have a Renaissance
Hmm.
violin, a medieval ancestor of the violin. Then I have a 12 string and a 14 string viola d'amore, one modern, one baroque.
Wow.
That's kind of a cousin of the violin. And I have my Flying V 6 string electric violin that I use when I'm playing with heavy metal bands. Yeah, and then I have a recording horn violin called a Stroh violin, where a horn comes out. I guess you could call it a violin d'acacia. I hadn't thought about that, but it's more about the amplification, pre-electric. And so it's about the sound being more direct and being able to go right into the acoustic recording horn in the early recorded era. It was used with jazz bands for a while as well. So yeah, different. Oh, and I have a tiny little pochette, which is the dancing master's fiddle that was used in the 1700s to play dance tunes. I use that for some of the Scottish fiddling. Um, and yeah, just basically they're all different kinds of violins. I don't play anything. People say, well, do you want to play the arhu? Do you want to play the viola da gamba? Well, those things are, um, you know, perpendicular to the ground. Is that the right way to say
Hmm.
it? Like a cello.
Sure.
And so
Hmm.
I only play things that are parallel to the ground,
Okay.
uh, like a violin. So at least that limits my wish list. And I've got a few left on the wish list still, but most of the big items have been acquired at this point. And yeah,
We'll
constantly
put a link
keeps
to your
me engaged.
Amazon wish list and people can get one for you. Just kidding.
I wish.
What um I want to know, you absolutely have to dream about violin.
Well,
You
my
have
husband
any?
says that when I'm asleep, I'm always fingering music. Yeah, and I'll be like sitting at lunch and my fingers are going. It's like there's this separate channel of my brain where music
Mhm.
is always playing, but it
Wow.
doesn't always break through to the conscious part of my brain.
Mhm.
But if you say to me, "Oh, what piece are you thinking about now?" then I have to kind of stop and then I like listen. I'm like, "Oh, it's such and such." But there's always something in there. It's like having a radio that never gets turned off, I guess.
Any actual dreams that you remember that were significant having violins?
Actually,
Yeah.
you could say, well, I have the stereotypical silly, oh no, I'm about to go on stage and just realized I never practiced for it. Everybody has that one, right? But
Mhm.
I also have dreams where I compose music and it's my own music and I like it feels so personal and I just love my creative ideas and then I wake up and unlike Tartini, who rushed to the manuscript pad and wrote it down, when I wake up I can't remember a darn thing, but I know that I wrote a beautiful melody. And I think that's a question of inhibition because pedagogy, in my generation, kids were not necessarily encouraged to write their own tunes or try their hand at alternative styles. And certainly if I, had the soul of a composer, I would have done it regardless. But, I was doing music all day, but I was practicing and rehearsing and performing, and I never took a minute to say, okay, let's be creative, not just creative with your interpretations of other
Mhm.
things, but let's create some music. Nobody ever even so much as suggested that to me. I didn't even start doing anything in the even vaguely improvisatory until I started doing baroque ornaments when I was 14. But that was just decorating existing melodies. I didn't start doing like, improvising over chord changes till I was in my 20s and started playing rock music on my violin.
Mhm.
So, my daughter, from her very earliest lessons with her teacher, when she could only bow on the open strings, she wasn't even playing any actual other notes yet. Her teacher would encourage her to make up her own rhythms, and she'd be like, "Wait, what am I supposed to play?" And then her teacher would have her say words and figure out that rhythm in words, and then hear
Mm.
how that sounded and play something else. And so her entire life, she's been brought up to improvise and to compose. And you could see this with other kids of the current generation. It's so much more natural, and it's actually more historic.
Mm.
And in the 1700s, you never had, a musician who never wrote anything. Some people were more on the performer end of the spectrum. But you also never had a composer who never performed and just sat there and wrote music and gave it to others. That just simply that separation never existed. And of course, the standard of playing, got higher and higher and higher, and composing got more and more complex with the expansion of the orchestra. So it makes sense why things started to change, but at the
Mhm.
same time, I think it's entirely unhealthy for composers never to like break out an instrument and play something. I think it's entirely unhealthy
Mhm.
for players of instruments to never make up something. And so, yeah, I think that's the one thing that I wish that I could do in real life what I can do in my dreams, but at least I have the comfort of knowing that my daughter has never been squashed in her musical imagination, and she
Yeah.
not only doing it, but she teaches a class to her peers on how to improvise, and there's so much more of that happening. It's really there's a lot that's going bad in our world right now, that's going backwards, that's of great concern, but when it comes to musical pedagogy, um, I think things are actually going in the right direction and getting better and better.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean it's fascinating the incredible level of resources we have. I mean, I was just talking to again our masterclass instructor from Thursday, and I just love. Uh, I read this book about historical music. It was kind of I forget the name of it for some reason offhand, but it went back into like what were the earliest um, compositions that got written down, like a Greek piece that was one of the earliest compositions that got written down, and then coming up to today. And so I went and I said, I want to listen to that, right? Because for some reason, a book like that, it didn't have like you're like, where's the accompanying CD or so they didn't have it. So I went and I listened to it. And then from then forward, I get to kind of like Spotify will like introduce me to all of these, crazy sounds from historical instruments and things like that. So it's like it's like you said, back in the day, you'd have to go to the library and go order
Yep.
something. You'd have to
Borrow an
go to some,
LP if they even
yeah,
had it.
yeah. And now it's so wonderful. You could just explore so much and go so deep on so many issues. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes it's, overwhelm where kids don't know where to look, but with a little bit of curation and guidance, it's like the resources are just exponentially more vast. And it's cool to see kids who are into obscure kinds of music, whether it's a kind of world music or a more historic strand of pop music that, had a blip in history that doesn't play on the radio, but they found it on some playlist and they listened to more and they discovered an affinity of classical, of course, is great that, people who might be culturally intimidated to go to a concert hall, which is something I always try to educate people that, just wear your good jeans and
Mhm.
it's going to be welcoming, give it a try. But, in terms of listening to the music online, it's so wonderful that people can just go and explore and hear these things. And yeah, I have great optimism for our art form, both in terms of future audiences and future players.
On that note, given that you have all this like archival material, number one, is there often a way to find it digitally? And if not, do you digitize what you bring in, right? Or do you not have time or, so like for example, you said you had that score and it had annotations, from the original author. Is that something where we'll go, okay, I'm going to digitize this?
Definitely,
And whether
it's
you share it or not, but like I want
yeah.
a digital copy. Yeah.
Well, definitely it's on my to-do
On
list
the to-do list.
to
Yeah.
do certain things, but we have, mainly, we've been working on the Black composers front just because that's, kind of
Yes.
the auspices of my foundation. And so a lot of things that are not under copyright, we've now scanned them and we need to find the next volunteer. One volunteer scanned them, right? We need to find the next volunteer to, sit at the computer and get them all uploaded to IMSLP so that they will be out there. And so that'll happen sometime in the next few years, and that'll really expand the potential of this body of repertoire when people
Great.
can at least get some of those things online for free. Now, edited editions is another matter. And so there's a value to having things re-engraved if they're in manuscript or just, haven't been kind of meticulously, carefully edited. So yeah, so and we've gotten some things into the computer already and lots more to go. As I
Yeah.
said, I will never be bored.
And so much time in the day. Yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you. Of course, we'll wrap up here soon. Appreciate your time. Before we jet, any final words, where you'd like to send people to find out more or check out a recording or, words of
Yeah, well,
advice or what do you got?
I've got a website, which is, I guess, the hub. So it links to all my socials. It has my tour dates, links to my foundation, my old I had a podcast like long ago, called Violin Adventures. I discontinued it upon parenthood. Um, as you said, only so many hours in a day, but it was really fun while it lasted. So I definitely appreciate what you do. And
But it's still out there, right?
oh
A
yeah, you can
podcast.
find it
That's a
on.
nice thing about podcasts. It's like once you do it and you put it out there on the RSS, it's there. People can always go back and check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not on Spotify and it's not on YouTube because those weren't even things back when I was doing it. But it is on Apple and it's just out there on Google, on its own whatever feed. So, yeah, Violin Adventures. If y'all are podcast fans, you can find mine. And yeah, it's got about 80 episodes or something. I did it for a while. Really fun.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and hopefully I'll get to see everybody at a in-person concert, and if not, hopefully, online.
Yeah, yeah. If you get a chance to catch Rachel, is it presumptuous to say try to come up and say hi and introduce yourself if they saw you on the program?
Actually, I always make sure that I'm at, the meet and greet table in the lobby after every concert. Uh,
Wonderful.
because, it's fun to meet people who are fans of music. It's fun to meet kids who are studying music. Actually, it's fun to meet grown-ups or seniors who are studying music. That's my
I
favorite when
love
someone
that.
says,
I
I wanted
love
to play
that.
the violin my whole life and I just started and they're like in their 60s or something. It's never too late. I'm sure it's the same way with piano, it's like if you wanted to do it, then like just start trying and you can have a lot of fun with it. And that's the
My
best.
absolute favorite is the person who's an adult who's at the recital with all of the kids. So, and you got like the 10-year-old, the 6-year-old, the 12-year-old, and they go, well, Janine she's a retired doctor and she just thought she wanted to take up the violin. So here she is, and it's so sweet. I love that.
Absolutely. Or the young couple who actually went to the symphony on a date. That's always cool when you see them. Um,
It's a good date idea. I feel like with dating, by the way, people need to, it's like just about time, sort of with the historical instruments, people could start going back to those old things. Got everything's digital and people are meeting on apps and stuff like that. Show up with flowers, take someone to a soda shop.
Yeah, well, one of my dreams for classical music is that more of it starts to, think outside the box in terms of setting. I mean, there's a lot that's happening. Like I was just with the Winnipeg Symphony, and they have these Thursday night hour and 15-minute concerts. So you're in, you're out, you have dinner, you hear a great orchestra concert, and it's a different kind of thing than going to a hour and 45 with a intermission. Makes a big difference. Some people are starting to do chamber music in places where there are tables and chairs, and you can do what you used to do in the 1800s and have a glass of wine while you listen to the trios. Um,
Yes.
Now it almost seems like an anachronism in a way to do this 20th century thing of sitting in a hall in rows, all stayad with the orchestra, wearing, I mean, even costuming. Orchestras used to wear tuxes because their audience was wearing tuxes. So instead of saying it's traditional to wear tuxes, you should say it's traditional to match your audience. That would
Hmm.
be a different way to look at the same data. Okay, I'm married to a statistician, so I think like that. But in any case, you know, orchestras that dress, respectfully, but a little less stuffily, right?
Hmm.
I think that even makes a difference to how the audience is feeling being there. Well,
Hmm.
certainly some people love seeing, yeah, and I love wearing ball gowns, you can't get away from that. But do we really need those tuxedos that are going to choke all those poor men? Is there a point? I don't know. Yeah, so anyway, I hope that in terms of concert timing, concert settings, talking to the audience, all these things that are starting to happen. Um, I think it's a really healthy way to go, and that we have to, and of course, repertoire. It's, there's all this talk right now about DEI being not a good thing, but how is more good music ever not a good thing, right? I mean, different performers bring different ideas to the table, different compositions open your mind to beautiful melodies that you would never have otherwise heard. And the more good music, the better. Limiting ourselves to just a narrow slice of the repertoire or only certain performers, that's not how the art is going to be served, and that's not how we're going to have the most fun and enjoyment as listeners. So forget ideas of justice. Let's just say this is the best thing for the art itself. I mean, not that justice isn't important, but in a way that's like beside the point when it
Beside
comes
the
to
point. Yeah.
and so, yeah, so I think it's been really exciting for audiences to discover these composers that no doubt would have been in the canon all along, if not for deliberate discrimination. And yeah, so there's so much great stuff happening, and I'm just really looking forward, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, like what is our classical scene going to look like? And I bet it's going to be, better and stronger than ever.
Wonderful. Well, I'll walk us out and we'll end the program, but it has been a pleasure. We have reached the end of another musical journey here at Piano Tech Radio Hour. Thanks to Rachel for joining us. As always, we're brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters all within your home. If you did join us today by signing up for this session individually, you could make your life more convenient. You could subscribe to Piano Tech Radio Hour. You would get the recording of today's session. Remember, automatic registration for each private Zoom call. You can sign up at bit.ly/join PTRH, bit.ly/join PTRH. Don't forget about the podcast, the audio only versions at pianotechradio.com, the Substack of Piano Technicians Masterclasses with some blog content, and our social medias, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and we'll see you next week. Rachel, after we sign off, go ahead, jump back on. We'll do a little wrap up, just you and me, okay?
Okay, well, thanks to everyone. Thanks to you for having me, and thanks.